The floor is yours, David.
Thanks, Manuel. It's really great to have a chance to talk with you today and virtually with all of the parties to the covenant processes and active in these issues in the Netherlands. It's a process that Shift, my organization, and I have been involved with for quite a while because we really recognize its uniqueness and importance in this space. And in particular, to have a chance to talk about remedy and some of the thinking and work that we've been taking forward around remedy in collaboration first with the Dutch banking sector agreement, where I think we really shaped up this approach to thinking about remedy differently, really rethinking approaches to remedy.
It would be great if you could help us gain a better understanding of what does access to remedy really mean in general, and what are the goals that this concept.
You framed it up nicely in terms of it's not a surprise, the challenge that you see where those who are affected are seeking remedy from those who cause or contribute to harm. And companies, particularly the companies that are part of the covenant processes, where a lot of the impacts aren't going to be caused directly by those companies, but are going to be further down in their value chain, struggle with what does that mean in practice. I think that's a dynamic that we see broadly across the world, not unique to a particular sector, not unique to Dutch companies. Again, a lot of my work these days is working with companies to rethink these approaches of thinking about remedy in a value chain context. When you are probably one or more steps removed from the impact and someone else is playing that role. But broadly, in terms of what's the expectation, I mean, why remedy? The guiding principles in the OECD guidelines are set up to really put on prevention of harm. That's what due diligence is all about, is let's prevent all the harm that we can. That's what all of the new regulations are about, is helping companies take the steps, requiring companies to take the steps to prevent harm. But both the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines recognize that if we only focused all of our efforts on prevention and didn't plan for the reality that impacts are going to occur, particularly impacts beyond our control, then we would we wouldn't be fulfilling the expectations of those who are harmed, of those who are affected by business activities. And so the UNGPs have this third pillar around remedy, which says when impacts occur, those who are affected have a right to remedy. They have a right, they need access to remedy. That means they need to be made whole again. That might be financial compensation. It might be reinstatement if it was an illegal firing or termination from employment. It could be guarantees of non-repetition, meaning we will make sure this doesn't happen again. Sometimes it's as simple as an apology. Sometimes it is acknowledgement of harm or being heard. Especially where part of the harm or the dynamic is that these are stakeholders who have been marginalized throughout, and part of the remedy is simply to be heard, and then to address the harm that's been caused and to have a role in that process. So that's the expectation of remedy. In terms of what companies are supposed to do, a company is supposed to provide or contribute to remedy whenever it has caused or contributed to harm. And that makes perfect sense. If you played a role in leading to a harm, then you have a role to play in fixing that harm. The challenge that we see comes in this space of linkage under the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines, where I didn't play a role. Yes, I'm connected to it through my value chain, but I didn't do anything wrong. There are other parties deeper down in my value chain who caused the harm. They're the ones who are supposed to be providing or contributing to remedy. And I think where we have missed the opportunity and why we've struggled to have a more meaningful conversation around remedy and why we struggle to think about what's a practical action is we've not yet filled in that gap of what's my role in remedy in that scenario. When another company that I'm connected to has caused or contributed to the harm, I'm linked. I still have a role to play, but what is that role? It's not to open my checkbook and write a check to stakeholders. It is to make sure that the right parties, the responsible parties, those who caused or contributed to harm, play a role in providing and contributing to remedy. And that's where we've been going with this framing of a remedy ecosystem or enabling remedy. It's really shifting the conversation from just focusing on when do I need to provide or contribute to remedy to what's my role in enabling remedy whenever impacts occur that I'm connected to. remedy is one of the most significant issues facing the business and human rights space today, as far as I'm concerned, and I think others would agree, because what we see is a global gap in remedy, meaning there are far too many impacts for which there is no remedy, precisely because of this dynamic where those parties that may be thinking about remedy aren't the ones who are responsible for providing remedy or even can provide the remedy in many cases. Those parties who are responsible for providing or contributing to remedy may not have the understanding of that responsibility. They may not have the commitment or the capacity to do so. And so what we see in practice is just a massive gap in the remedy that is required for the impacts that we're all connected to, and the remedy that is actually made available to stakeholders at the end of the day. And so that's why we really need to fill this gap with a concerted effort to think about, well, what roles can I play? And I think what we want to do is make that more a part of, embed that in the due diligence process. And so in the work we did with the Dutch banking sector agreement and all the parties there, but also the work that we've taken forward with other multinationals, particularly in agribusiness supply chains, and particularly with financial institutions, is thinking about a few different buckets of action that we can think about. The first is preparation for remedy. What are the things we can do as part of our due diligence to recognize that impacts are likely, particularly in higher risk value chains? What are we going to do? What's going to happen when impacts occur? So one of the things that we typically see is a requirement for grievance mechanisms. I'm not thinking about our own here, which have a role to play, but asking suppliers to have grievance mechanisms or asking bank clients to have grievance mechanisms. And that's great, but I think where we've fallen short is we've asked the question, do you have a grievance mechanism? And haven't really focused on, is it worth anything? Is it effective in practice? Do stakeholders trust it? Do they use it? Is it capable of providing remedy? Has it done so before? So that's one piece, is really moving from, do you have a grievance mechanism, to really assessing the effectiveness of it. The second thing is then recognizing that the great majority, the vast majority of grievance mechanisms are not effective. They would not meet the expectations of the UNGP's effectiveness criteria for grievance mechanisms. So what role can either larger companies or companies further up the value chain or groups of smaller enterprises through industry associations, what role can they play in supporting more effective grievance mechanisms on the ground in particularly high-risk value chains or segments of value chains? The other things that we can do is think about complementary mechanisms. So if it's not the company mechanism, if stakeholders don't trust it, where else are they going to turn? We think about this as a grievance architecture. Are there national institutions that stakeholders could turn to? A national human rights institution, a labor inspectorate, a national contact point for the OECD guidelines. What are the other complementary mechanisms? Eventually, we can talk about what role a covenant mechanism might play in that process as well. Those are not going to be as well equipped, generally speaking, to provide remedy on the ground to stakeholders as a really strong company mechanism or site-based mechanism, but they have a really important role to play, both as escalation pathways if the company mechanism isn't working, and as accountability to make sure that those other mechanisms are working. They also play a role in visibility. If I see complaints coming into my mechanism, then I have a sense of what the actual impacts are, and I can focus my resources there. So that's one piece, which is the pathways for remedy. Where are people going to turn when impacts occur? But it's equally about, and this is the phrase that I really hope people take forward into their roundtable discussions, is thinking about leverage for remedy. What does it mean to use our leverage for remedy? Leverage before we get into a relationship or before impacts occur, and leverage after impacts occur, roles we can play. So when I think about leverage for remedy, I'm thinking about the conversations that we have through supplier engagement or partner engagement to convey our expectations through a supply chain code of conduct or through other forms where we set expectations for our business partners. What are we saying about remedy in those conversations? Are we ensuring that our partners understand the responsibility for remedy if impact should occur? Are they equipped to do so? Do they have the resources available if impact should occur? But resources alone and pathways alone don't get you there if the mindset isn't there. And so that's why I focus on the setting the right expectations for remedy. Companies themselves can set those expectations in their own policy frameworks. We worked with a few financial institutions who have embedded into their human rights policy a commitment to enabling remedy. meaning we will bring a focus to the remedy conversation whenever we learn of impacts in our value chain. Typically what happens is impacts are far away. There could be a dispute over the facts. One party says something happened and so is responsible. The other party says it didn't happen or we're not responsible. I'm sitting thousands of miles away. I am not a fact finder. I'm not an investigator. What am I to do? And so typically what we see is a focus on forward-looking measures. So instead of saying, how do we fix the harm that may or may not have occurred, the alleged harm that occurred, we say, well, how do we just make sure that if it did occur, it doesn't happen again? If it didn't occur, something like that doesn't happen. That can be a part of remedy, but it's incomplete because it doesn't take account of what the stakeholders might need to be made whole again. So how can we shift that dynamic instead of only focusing on, using it as a potential risk, actually focusing on the impact that may have occurred? And that's where we get to what roles in entities, businesses, financial institutions can play after impacts occur. And there, we've seen these kinds of roles. They can support independent fact-finding. They can use conversations with their clients or their business partners to make sure they're paying attention to the remedy conversation and that their business partners care. They can engage with others in the value chain to build leverage to make sure that the responsible parties are providing or contributing to remedy. They can have a credible threat of disengagement. It doesn't mean you immediately look to cut ties, but it means that may be a part of the conversation. How do we set ourselves up so that we don't find ourselves after impacts occur with a very poorly dealt hand? Instead, we have a lot of tools in the toolkit, more opportunities to ensure that the right parties are providing remedy. I think the thing that we have seen is mistaking the idea, conflating grievance mechanisms for remedy and thinking that these two things are the same. They are not. Grievance mechanisms are one way that you can get to remedy under certain circumstances. Those circumstances require that the parties that are responsible for providing remedy participate in that process and can therefore contribute to remedy. If a stakeholder somewhere in my value chain files a complaint with my mechanism, I can't provide remedy for that. I may be able to use my leverage. I may be able to engage with the supplier to get them to provide remedy, but really what it's done is inform me that there is a problem. It's raised a red flag, but it's not going to be capable of providing remedy in almost all cases. Now, if I contributed to the harm, then I can use that mechanism to contribute to the remedy. But it's going to be really challenging to think that that building my own mechanism is going to solve problems all over the world, because if I'm a worker in a factory at a supplier or a supplier's supplier, do I really know all of the buyers and know where to turn if an impact should occur? No, I know what's right in front of me, and what's right in front of me is this company, and either a receptive ear or a non-receptive ear to impacts. So the best thing I can do is try to equip my suppliers to understand why grievance mechanisms at the site level are actually really good for business, and understand their role in providing remedy, and that we want to be their partners in that, and that we want to support their efforts in whatever ways we can. So one of my favorite examples is from a big global multinational apparel company. And that may feel foreign to some of the smaller enterprises that are part of, many of whom are part of these covenants, because they won't be able to do all the things that this company might have done. But it's a mindset shift, and that's what I want to highlight, is a mindset shift. And really thinking creatively about what role I can play to get to remedy. So this global apparel company had a supplier in Cambodia. And the supplier, actually they had a supplier in Hong Kong or Singapore. And that supplier subcontracted to a supplier in Cambodia. And this company didn't know about it. Turns out there were major impacts on the ground. Workers weren't paid. Workers weren't given the safety net that they needed. They were working excessive hours. And then the owner of this company fled the country, took all the money and ran, leaving workers with no pay for 6 months, no severance package, no safety net, no nothing. The way this company found out about it is it actually had a great collaboration with the trade union, and that trade union informed them that their products, their branded products, were found in this factory, and the workers who were not paid were making this brand's clothing, even though the brand didn't know. So the brand said, look, we did all the right things to try to prevent this from happening. Our due diligence systems were really strong to make sure that subcontracting didn't occur. So we don't think we've contributed to this harm. We'll ask the question, but we don't think we did. But yet there are workers who've been harmed. So what can we do? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to engage our supplier who didn't do everything right, who subcontracted illegally to this company and didn't do the right due diligence. They're going to play a role in remedy. They're going to contribute some resources. There's still going to be not enough resources to pay all these back wages. We're going to engage with the affected stakeholders and try to jointly problem solve this and simply let these workers know you're being heard and we want you to be part of the solution, which is a big step as well. Then we're going to look at what we have available. And what they had available was a premises and some equipment and some other assets. And we are going to help the workers sell off this equipment, create a pooled fund, and use those resources coupled with resources from the Hong Kong-based supplier to make a contribution to remedy, not our company making a contribution, but some contribution to the remedy that's required to help these workers out. Now, that company didn't open its checkbook at all. It did provide some human resources and some thought leadership to make this happen. But ultimately what they did, the third piece was they engaged with the government to say what's available from the government. And so we're going to try to create this package that is capable of compensating the workers that weren't paid in some way. The mindset that they used was, we've got a problem and we need to solve it. Now, what could we do to solve it? What resources could we deploy to solve it? Not, we didn't cause it, we didn't contribute to it, so it's not my problem. And that's what we want to shift.
How do you think RBC agreements, either individually or collectively, could help enable remediation in general? What are the actions that they could take collectively? And what is your advice for these agreements in this regard? How could they be helpful in enabling remediation in the global value chains?
So I think that the Dutch agreements are recognized around the world for their innovative approach. These are multi-stakeholder dialogues where parties are coming together to talk about responsible business conduct, what should due diligence look like, what's the role of companies in these value chains. And so and I can tell you with the Dutch banking sector agreement in that paper, it has had a tremendous influence globally on conversations across the financial sector. It's been picked up and there's a lot of action now around it, built on it, based on it, to take that thinking and put it into practice further. So I think we see the power of a multi-stakeholder process like these covenants in shifting the conversation around remedy from, do you have a grievance mechanism, to what's your approach to remedy? And the more that the covenants can speak to that issue of recognizing the remedy gap, recognizing that it's not about shifting responsibility for remedy to parties that didn't contribute to harm, but it is about recognizing a role for all parties connected in remedy. That is probably the most significant impact that the covenants can have, is in helping to shift those conversations and take those forward into the global industry conversations, whatever the covenant might be. The second thing, and more practically speaking, what that means is not settling for what feels like the easy answer, but is not likely to ultimately have impact in terms of better outcomes for people at the end of the day. And that is saying we'll all build our own grievance mechanisms, or we'll build a covenant grievance mechanism. Again, I'm not saying those don't have roles to play. What I'm suggesting is let's recognize what that role is. Those roles are more about accountability and visibility into impacts. If we want to bring a focus to remedy, we need to make sure that we are driving those conversations back down where impacts occur and making sure that credible pathways exist when impacts occur. But I think there's a temptation to settle and say, we will all build our own grievance mechanisms. And yes, we'll open them up to third-party complaints. Again, that's probably not going to be the most effective way for us to actually get to more remedy at the end of the day. So let's do those things. Let's build our own grievance mechanisms. Let's have accountability mechanisms at the covenant level, but let's recognize what role they can and cannot play in getting to remedy, and then let's make sure we're doing the other things that we think can actually get us to more remedy at the end of the day. If I could leave the parties with just one thought for that they take forward into those breakout conversations, it's get creative. And when I say creative, I mean, don't settle, and actually ask the question: how do we actually help those who are harmed? What role could we reasonably play that we actually think could make a difference in getting to more remedy at the end of the day? Have that conversation. And brainstorm that and think creatively, recognizing that we're all differently situated. I'm an SME, I'm part of an industry association, I'm a big global multinational. But what role could we play if we wanted to get there? And if we have that conversation, I think we might get to some really interesting dialogue and hopefully really good outcomes.
Definitely a great food for thought, which you'll be bringing together to the group on the night. So thanks, David, for those last wise words. Thank you for joining us, and see you on the night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.